I realized they believed I was a helpless widow the moment my daughter-in-law lowered her voice at the church entrance and said, just loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, "Margaret is going to have a hard time now. Richard handled all the money." The words floated through the cold morning air like a quiet verdict on my future, and I watched the expressions of the guests change as they looked at me. Some offered polite smiles. Others nodded with the soft sympathy people reserve for someone they assume has just lost everything. I stood at the top of the stone steps outside St. Andrew's Church, holding my small black purse in both hands, the same purse I had carried for years to Sunday services with my husband. The autumn wind moved through the tall oak trees in the churchyard, carrying the smell of fallen leaves and damp earth, and for a moment I simply listened to the murmurs of the arriving guests, to the low hum of voices that always gathers before a funeral begins. My husband, Richard Whitmore, had been a respected man in our town for more than 40 years. People knew him as a careful businessman, the quiet owner of Whitmore Industrial Supply, a company that had started in a small warehouse and grown into a regional operation. What most people didn't know was how carefully Richard planned everything in his life, right down to the smallest details. Vanessa, my daughter-in-law, stood near the church doors greeting guests like she was hosting a charity gala instead of a funeral. Her dark coat was perfectly tailored, and her voice carried that polished tone she used whenever she wanted people to believe she was being thoughtful. "We're just worried about Margaret," she told a group of Richard's former colleagues. She never really dealt with the finances. Daniel, my son, stood beside her with his hands in his pockets, nodding quietly. He didn't look at me when I walked past them. I noticed the way people glanced toward me afterward, the way their conversations softened when I approached. One older woman gently touched my arm and whispered, "If you need anything, dear." This must be overwhelming. I thanked her and gave the same calm smile I had been giving everyone all morning. They thought I was overwhelmed. They thought I was frightened. They thought the woman standing in black at the entrance of that church had just become poor overnight. The truth was that I had spent the entire previous night sitting alone at our kitchen table remembering something Richard said to me 2 months before he died. He had been standing by the window, looking out over the backyard where he used to grill on summer evenings. He spoke in that quiet, thoughtful way he had when he was already 10 steps ahead of everyone else. "Margaret," he said, "sometimes the smartest thing you can do is let people underestimate you." At the time I thought he was talking about a business negotiation he had been working on. Now, standing in the churchyard while Vanessa quietly told people how worried she was about my future, I understood what he meant. I also understood something else. My husband had not left me helpless, not even close. But as the church bells began to ring and the doors slowly opened for the service, I simply walked inside without correcting anyone. I let them believe exactly what they wanted to believe. After all, there was no reason to mention the $28 million. Not yet. I sat in the second row of the church while the organ played softly through the tall wooden rafters, and for the first time since Richard passed away the house had felt truly quiet that morning. The silence had followed me here, settling over my shoulders like the black coat I was wearing. People filled the pews slowly, the soft rustle of coats and whispered greetings echoing gently through the sanctuary. Stained glass windows cast muted colors across the polished floor, and the scent of old wood and candle wax hung in the air. I had been in this church hundreds of times over the years, but that morning every sound seemed sharper, every glance heavier. I noticed the way people looked at me when they thought I was not paying attention. There is a particular expression people wear when they believe someone has just become fragile. It is a mixture of sympathy and quiet calculation. I saw it in the eyes of Richard's former business partners, in the cautious nods of neighbors, even in the soft tilt of the pastor's head when he greeted me before the service. Vanessa sat 3 rows ahead with Daniel beside her, her posture straight and composed as she leaned slightly toward the guests around her. She spoke in that careful voice that carried just far enough for others to hear. "Richard always handled the financial side of things," she said gently. "Margaret never had to worry about that." A few people nodded as if that explained everything about my future. I could almost see the story forming in their minds. The devoted husband had passed away. The quiet widow had been left behind with little understanding of the world he managed. It was a simple story. People like simple stories. I folded my hands in my lap and watched the front of the church where Richard's photograph stood beside a large arrangement of white lilies. The picture had been taken 5 years earlier at a company dinner. He was smiling in the photograph, his shoulders relaxed in the dark suit he always wore to formal events. When we had taken that picture, he had leaned toward me afterward and whispered that the photographer made everyone look richer than they really were. That was Richard's humor, dry and subtle. The service began with a quiet hymn and the slow rise of the congregation. The pastor spoke about Richard's dedication to his work, his steady leadership, and his reputation for planning carefully. I noticed Daniel shift slightly in his seat when the pastor mentioned that word. Planning. Richard had always believed in preparation. He believed in protecting the future before trouble arrived. While the pastor continued speaking, I found my mind drifting back to the evening when Richard first began organizing his affairs. It had been late summer. The sun had been setting behind the maple trees in our backyard, and the warm air had carried the smell of freshly cut grass through the open windows. Richard had spread several folders across the dining room table while I poured coffee. He had told me not to worry about the details at the time, only that everything was arranged exactly the way it needed to be. I had trusted him completely because that was the kind of man he was. Now, sitting quietly in the church while Vanessa explained my supposed situation to anyone who would listen, I realized just how carefully he had arranged things. I also realized something else. Richard understood people better than most. He knew exactly how they would behave once he was gone. And judging by the quiet confidence in Vanessa's voice as she spoke to the guests around her, she believed the story she was telling. She believed the future had already been decided. I lowered my eyes toward my folded hands and allowed the same calm expression to remain on my face. There would be plenty of time later for the truth. For now, I simply listened, observed, and let them continue believing what they wanted to believe. I remained seated until the final hymn faded and the congregation slowly began to move toward the exit. Funerals always in the same way. Quiet footsteps, gentle handshakes, soft voices saying things like he lived a good life and he will be missed. People lined up near the front of the church to offer their condolences, and I stood there with my hands folded while one familiar face after another stepped forward. Many of them had known Richard for decades. Some had worked beside him since the earliest days of the company, back when the office was no larger than a 2-car garage on the edge of town. They spoke about his patience, his discipline, the way he never rushed decisions. I noticed something else in their voices too. Respect. Genuine respect. Yet even among those sincere words there were small pauses, moments when people looked at me with the quiet uncertainty reserved for someone they believe might now be alone in a world she does not fully understand. One of Richard's former suppliers, a tall man named Gregory Lewis, shook my hand and said softly that if I ever needed advice about managing things I should call him. The offer was kind, but I could hear the assumption beneath it. Vanessa stood a few steps away speaking to another group of guests. Her voice carried clearly through the room again. She explained how complicated Richard's business had always been and how grateful she was that Daniel would eventually help organize everything. I did not interrupt. Instead, I observed the subtle shift happening around the room. People were already adjusting their expectations. Some glanced toward Daniel with the quiet curiosity reserved for a man who might soon step into a larger role. Others nodded politely when Vanessa mentioned how difficult it might be for me to keep up with the house on my own. I thanked each guest for coming, repeating the same gentle words until the room slowly began to empty. Outside the church, the afternoon sun had begun to break through the clouds, casting long pale shadows across the parking lot. The wind had softened, and the air carried the faint smell of pine from the trees that lined the edge of the property. A black sedan waited near the curb to take the family to the cemetery, but before anyone moved, Vanessa stepped beside me and placed a hand lightly on my arm. Her expression held the careful concern she had been displaying all morning. She spoke quietly, but not so quietly that Daniel or the 2 relatives standing nearby could not hear. She said that after everything settled, we should talk about practical matters. She mentioned the house first. It was a large property, nearly 4,000 square feet with 2 acres of land behind it, and she wondered gently whether it might be too much for one person now. Daniel nodded slightly as if the idea had already been discussed. I looked at both of them for a moment, and then simply said that we would discuss everything later. My voice remained calm, the same calm tone I had used all day. Vanessa seemed satisfied with that answer. She turned back toward the waiting car with quiet confidence, and Daniel followed her without saying much at all. As we drove toward the cemetery, I looked out the window at the passing streets of the town Richard had lived in for most of his life. Every building seemed to hold a memory. The hardware store where he once bought his first tools. The small diner where we celebrated our 20th anniversary with nothing more than pie and coffee. People believed that today marked the end of Richard Whitmore's influence in this town. They believed the careful structure he built would slowly dissolve now that he was gone. But Richard never left anything unfinished. And somewhere inside my purse, resting quietly beside my gloves, was the small envelope his attorney had given me 2 days earlier. I had not opened it yet. Not because I was afraid of what it contained, but because I already knew something the others had not yet realized. Richard Whitmore had never been careless with the future. I remained quiet during the burial, standing beside Daniel while the minister finished the final prayer and the wind moved slowly. Across the open cemetery, the ground beneath our feet was still soft from the rain the night before, and the gray sky stretched endlessly above the rows of headstones that marked decades of this town's history. People began leaving one by one, offering quiet handshakes before walking back toward their cars. Vanessa spoke to nearly everyone, her voice warm and composed as she thanked them for supporting the family. I noticed how easily she stepped into the role of organizer, guiding conversations and answering questions as though she had already taken charge of the future. Daniel stayed mostly silent beside her, nodding politely when people spoke to him, occasionally glancing at me with an uncertain expression that disappeared whenever Vanessa touched his arm. By the time the last guest had left, only the three of us remained beside the freshly covered grave. The cemetery workers stood a respectful distance away near their truck, giving the family space before they began their quiet work. Vanessa brushed a small piece of dirt from the sleeve of her coat, and then turned toward me with the same calm expression she had worn all morning. She said that everyone should probably gather at the house later that evening to talk about what comes next. Her tone was gentle but purposeful, the kind of tone people use when they believe decisions are already moving forward. Daniel agreed quickly, mentioning that there were many things to organize now that his father was gone. I listened without interrupting, watching the clouds slowly shift across the pale afternoon sky. After a moment, Vanessa continued speaking, explaining that Richard had always been very busy with complicated financial matters and that it might take time for the family to understand everything he had managed. She added that Daniel would do his best to sort through the paperwork and make sure things stayed stable. Her words were carefully chosen, but the meaning was clear. They believed the responsibility would soon pass naturally to them. I nodded slowly and said that we could all talk later in the evening after everyone had rested. My voice remained steady, and for a moment Vanessa seemed satisfied with that answer. As we began walking back toward the parking lot, the wind lifted the edge of my coat, and I reached into my purse to make sure the small envelope was still there. The paper inside had weight to it, the quiet weight of something important waiting for the right moment. 2 days earlier, Richard's attorney, Robert Hensley, had placed that envelope into my hands across the polished desk of his office. He had spoken carefully, explaining that Richard had prepared certain documents long before his illness became serious. I had not asked many questions at the time because I trusted Richard's judgment the same way I had trusted it throughout our entire marriage. Now, standing in the cemetery parking lot while Daniel unlocked the car door, I realized how many people believed they already understood the situation. They believed the company, the house, and every decision connected to Richard's life would soon fall into predictable hands. Vanessa sat in the passenger seat and continued speaking quietly about organizing files and contacting accountants. Daniel listened and nodded, occasionally adding that they would figure everything out soon. I watched them both for a moment before closing the car door and settling into my seat. Neither of them noticed the small smile that crossed my face as I rested my purse on my lap. They were already planning the future. They simply did not realize that Richard had planned it first. That evening the house felt different the moment we stepped inside. For more than 30 years this place had been filled with Richard's steady presence, the quiet rhythm of his routines, the familiar sound of the back door closing when he returned from work. Now the silence felt wider, as if the rooms themselves were waiting to see what would happen next. Vanessa moved through the living room with surprising confidence, setting her purse on the coffee table and glancing around like someone already imagining how the space might be reorganized. Daniel followed her in, removing his jacket and hanging it over the back of a chair the same way he used to do when he was younger. I placed my purse carefully on the small wooden table beside the sofa and looked around the room that Richard and I had built our life in. The hardwood floors were still polished from the cleaning service that had come earlier in the week, and the long windows at the back of the house looked out across the 2 acres of land Richard had always insisted on maintaining himself every Saturday morning. Vanessa broke the silence first. She suggested that we sit down and talk about practical matters while everything was still fresh. Her tone was calm but purposeful, the tone of someone who believes time should not be wasted. Daniel nodded quickly, saying there were several things that needed attention, especially the company and the paperwork his father had left behind. I sat down slowly in the armchair Richard used to favor, resting my hands lightly on the arms while I listened. Vanessa explained that managing a business the size of Whitmore Industrial Supply would require quick decisions. She mentioned that clients would expect reassurance and that employees would need stability. Daniel agreed, adding that he had already been thinking about visiting the main office sometime later in the week. I noticed how easily the conversation moved forward without anyone asking me what Richard had shared with me during the past few months. They spoke as though the structure of the future was already clear. Vanessa then turned her attention to the house. She gently repeated the idea she had mentioned earlier that day, explaining that 4,000 square feet might be difficult for one person to manage alone. She suggested that perhaps a smaller place closer to town would be more comfortable. Daniel looked toward me carefully, waiting for my reaction. I allowed a small pause before speaking, the same calm pause Richard used to take when he was considering something important. I said that there would be time to evaluate every option after we understood exactly what Richard had arranged. Vanessa exchanged a quick glance with Daniel, and for a moment her confident expression shifted slightly. She asked what I meant by arranged. I reached for my purse and rested it on my lap, feeling the envelope inside without opening it. The paper was still sealed exactly as Robert Hensley had given it to me 2 days earlier in his office. I remembered the quiet seriousness in his voice when he told me that Richard had spent years preparing certain documents that would guide the future of the company and the family assets. Vanessa leaned forward slightly, curiosity now replacing her earlier certainty. Daniel waited silently beside her. I looked at both of them for a moment, and then said that tomorrow morning I would be meeting with Robert Hensley to review everything Richard had left behind. The room became very still after that. Vanessa straightened in her seat, and Daniel's expression shifted from confidence to quiet uncertainty. I rested my hands calmly on my purse and looked around the living room once more. The same familiar room. The same quiet evening light filtering through the windows. The only difference was that the future they believed they understood had not yet been revealed. The next morning the house was quiet long before the sun fully rose above the trees behind the property. I woke earlier than usual, the way people often do after a long and emotional day, and for a moment I simply sat at the edge of the bed listening to the stillness of the house. For decades Richard had been the first one awake, moving quietly through the hallway toward the kitchen to make coffee before the rest of the day began. That morning the silence reminded me again that his routines had ended, but the careful plans he left behind had not. I dressed slowly and walked downstairs, the wooden steps creaking softly beneath my feet. The kitchen window faced east, and the early morning light stretched across the wide countertop where Richard used to spread out his paperwork late at night. I placed my purse on the table and poured a cup of coffee, then sat down for a moment and looked at the envelope that had remained unopened since Robert Hensley handed it to me. The paper was thick and official, sealed with a small line of adhesive across the back. Richard always preferred important documents to be handled carefully, and I could almost imagine him standing beside me now with that quiet expression he wore whenever he knew something others had not yet discovered. I slipped the envelope back into my purse because there would be time soon enough to review everything with Robert in person. The drive to his office took about 20 minutes. The streets were calm at that hour, with only a few delivery trucks and early commuters moving through the town. Robert Hensley's office sat on the second floor of a brick building near the courthouse, a place Richard had visited many times over the years. When I arrived, Robert greeted me with the same steady professionalism he had always shown our family. His gray suit was perfectly pressed, and his office smelled faintly of old books and polished wood. He asked me to sit down across from his desk and then folded his hands together before speaking. Robert explained that Richard had begun reorganizing certain financial structures nearly 8 years earlier. At the time, Richard had mentioned that he wanted to simplify matters for the future, but Robert admitted that the level of detail Richard requested had been unusually thorough even for a man known for careful planning. Robert then opened a large folder and turned several pages toward me. Inside were documents outlining trusts, investment accounts, and ownership structures connected to Whitmore Industrial Supply. Robert spoke slowly, making sure every detail was clear. According to the records, Richard had placed the majority of the company's shares into a protected trust several years ago. The trust had one primary controlling beneficiary, me. I listened quietly while Robert continued explaining the scope of what Richard had arranged. Beyond the company itself, there were multiple investment accounts spread across several institutions, along with property holdings and long-term financial instruments that Richard had accumulated over decades. Robert summarized everything in one calm sentence. The total value of the assets under the trust was approximately $28 million. The number hung quietly in the air between us, but I did not react with surprise because Richard had always believed in preparation. What surprised Robert more was my calm response. I simply nodded and asked what Richard had instructed should happen next. Robert leaned back slightly in his chair and said that the trust documents gave me full authority over the company, the investments, and every decision related to them. No one else held control unless I chose to grant it. As I listened, I thought about Vanessa's confident voice the day before, about the way she had already begun explaining the future to everyone around her. Robert closed the folder gently and asked if I had any immediate questions. I rested my hands calmly on the desk and said that I believed Richard had already answered most of them long before today. When I left Robert Hensley's office that morning, the sky had cleared completely, and the sunlight reflected brightly against the windows of the courthouse across the street. The town looked exactly the same as it had the day before, the same quiet sidewalks and familiar storefronts, yet something inside me had shifted. For the first time since Richard's funeral, I understood the full shape of the future he had prepared. I walked slowly to my car, holding my purse close as I thought about the conversation waiting for me at home. Vanessa and Daniel believed they were moving toward a discussion about how to organize the business. They believed they were stepping into responsibilities that would naturally fall into their hands. What they did not realize was that Richard had spent nearly a decade ensuring the opposite. The drive back took the same 20 minutes as before, but the road seemed calmer now. I passed the small diner where Richard and I used to stop on Saturday mornings, the gas station where he always insisted on checking the tire pressure himself, and the park where Daniel used to play when he was a boy. For a moment, I remembered the years when Daniel would run ahead of us across the grass, while Richard walked beside me explaining some new idea he had for the company. Richard always believed in building something that would last beyond him. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked peaceful in the afternoon light. The large maple tree near the front porch cast a wide shadow across the lawn, and for a moment the place felt exactly as it always had. Inside the living room, I found Vanessa seated on the sofa with a laptop open in front of her. Daniel stood near the window, speaking quietly into his phone, his voice low and serious. They both looked up when I entered. Vanessa closed the laptop halfway and asked how the meeting with Robert Hensley had gone. Her tone was polite, but beneath it I could hear the expectation she had carried since the funeral. Daniel ended his call and walked toward the center of the room, waiting for my answer. I placed my purse on the table and sat down slowly in the same chair I had used the evening before. For a moment, I simply looked at both of them. Vanessa's posture remained confident, though I noticed the slight tension in her shoulders. Daniel looked uncertain, as though he sensed that something important had been clarified during the meeting. I explained that Robert had reviewed all of the documents Richard prepared over the years. Vanessa nodded quickly and asked whether the company accounts would be difficult to manage. She mentioned that Daniel had already been thinking about speaking with the senior managers at Whitmore Industrial Supply to make sure operations continued smoothly. I listened carefully before answering. I said that Richard had arranged the company structure many years ago and that the ownership had been placed inside a trust designed to protect it from confusion or disputes. Vanessa leaned forward slightly when she heard that word. Trust. She asked who the trust was meant to protect. I reached into my purse and placed the folder Robert had given me on the table. The documents rested there quietly between us. Daniel looked down at them with a puzzled expression. Vanessa waited for me to continue. I spoke calmly, the same way Richard used to speak when he was explaining something that required patience to understand. I said that according to the trust documents, the authority over Whitmore Industrial Supply and the investment accounts connected to it belonged entirely to the primary beneficiary named by Richard. Daniel asked who that beneficiary was. I looked at him for a moment before answering. The primary beneficiary was me. For several seconds no one spoke. The folder remained on the table between us, its pages neatly organized with the careful precision Richard always preferred. Daniel looked from the documents to me and then back again as though he was trying to understand how something so important had never been mentioned before. Vanessa was the first to move. She leaned forward slightly and opened the folder, scanning the first page with the focused attention of someone searching for a detail that would confirm her expectations. Her eyes moved quickly across the lines of legal text, but the longer she read, the quieter she became. Daniel stepped closer to the table and looked over her shoulder. I watched them both without speaking. The room felt unusually still, the afternoon sunlight stretching across the hardwood floor in long golden lines. Outside the window, the branches of the maple tree moved gently in the breeze, the same calm motion that had been there the day before and the day before that. Vanessa finally looked up from the papers and asked if Robert Hensley had explained the structure of the trust completely. Her voice was steady but no longer carried the confidence it had earlier. I said that he had reviewed every detail with me that morning. Daniel frowned slightly and asked what that meant for the company. He said that he had already planned to speak with several managers later that week because he assumed the responsibility would naturally pass to him. I answered carefully, choosing my words the way Richard often did when he wanted to make something clear without creating unnecessary conflict. I explained that the trust Richard created did not automatically transfer authority to anyone except the primary beneficiary. According to the documents, all decisions related to Whitmore Industrial Supply, including leadership changes and financial management, required the approval of that beneficiary. Daniel looked at me again, this time with visible confusion. Vanessa closed the folder slowly and placed both hands on the table as if steadying herself before asking the next question. She asked whether the trust included the company's shares only or if it also covered the investment accounts Richard had managed privately. I reached forward and turned one page of the document so they could both see the summary Robert had prepared. The list included the company ownership, the real estate holdings connected to the business, and several investment portfolios accumulated over decades. Daniel read the numbers quietly, his expression tightening as he realized how much had been placed into that structure years earlier. Vanessa remained silent for a moment longer before asking who would be responsible for managing all of those assets now. I answered in the same calm tone I had used since the conversation began. I said that the trust documents made the responsibility very clear. The authority remained entirely with me unless I chose to delegate it. The words settled into the room like the final piece of a puzzle being placed exactly where it belonged. Daniel leaned back slightly as though reconsidering everything he had assumed since the funeral. Vanessa's posture changed as well, the confident certainty she carried earlier replaced by careful attention. I closed the folder and rested my hands lightly on top of it. The house was quiet again, just as it had been that morning before I drove to Robert Hensley's office. For the first time since Richard's passing, the direction of the future had been spoken out loud, and the room felt very different because of it. Daniel remained standing beside the table for a long moment after the documents were closed, as though he was still trying to organize the new reality inside his mind. Vanessa did not reach for the folder again. Instead, she leaned back slowly into the sofa and folded her hands together in her lap, the way people do when they realize the conversation has moved beyond the assumptions they carried into the room. The late afternoon sunlight had shifted across the living room floor, climbing gradually up the legs of the coffee table where the folder rested. For years, Richard had loved that hour of the day, the quiet moment when the house settled into a peaceful rhythm before evening. I could almost hear his voice again, calm and thoughtful, reminding me that patience was often the strongest position a person could take. Daniel finally spoke, his voice slower than before. He said that he had not realized his father arranged everything so carefully. There was no anger in his tone, only surprise and a certain amount of humility. Vanessa glanced toward him briefly and then back toward me, studying my face with a different expression than the one she had worn earlier that week. The certainty she once carried had been replaced with caution. I rested my hands calmly on the folder and explained that Richard believed strongly in preparation. I said that over the years he often talked about protecting the company from confusion or conflict after he was gone. Daniel nodded quietly, as though the explanation made sense when he remembered the way his father approached every decision in life. Vanessa asked one more question, her voice now measured and respectful. She asked whether the trust allowed anyone else to help manage the company if I chose to involve them. I answered honestly. The documents allowed me to appoint advisors or managers whenever I believed it was appropriate, but the authority to make those choices remained mine alone. The room grew quiet again after that. Daniel walked toward the window and looked out across the lawn where the maple tree cast long shadows over the grass. When he turned back toward me, his expression carried something I had not seen since he was much younger. Respect. He said that if I ever needed help understanding the operations at Whitmore Industrial Supply, he would be willing to assist. I thanked him and told him that I appreciated the offer. Vanessa did not speak for several seconds, but eventually she nodded slowly, as if accepting the situation for what it was. I could see that she was reconsidering everything she had expected during the past few days. The future she had imagined had shifted into something very different. I closed the folder and placed it back into my purse. The conversation was finished, but the understanding it created would shape everything that followed. Outside, the sky had turned a soft shade of orange as the sun moved lower behind the trees. The same peaceful evening light that Richard loved now filled the house once more. I stood up slowly and walked toward the hallway, leaving Daniel and Vanessa sitting quietly in the living room. As I reached the staircase, I paused for a moment and looked back at the room where we had spent so many years together as a family. The house had not changed, the town had not changed, and the people inside it were still learning the same lesson Richard understood long ago. Sometimes the strongest move a person can make is simply allowing others to believe the wrong story until the truth arrives on its own.